Hello and welcome to the second video on female reproductive anatomy and physiology. In the last video we went through all the primary organs in the female reproductive system, and in this video we're going to look at oogenesis and folliculogenesis, development of the oocytes, the egg cells. Just briefly go through that and how that's affected at the different stages by various hormones. And then we'll focus on the female reproductive cycle and how that's regulated by the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, and then look at all the different phases of the reproductive cycle. So the development of a female egg cell requires two processes that go together. One is known as oogenesis, and the other is known as folliculogenesis. So oogenesis is the series of stages of the development of the actual ovum or egg, versus folliculogenesis describes the whole process whereby the surrounding cells, which help to nourish and support that egg, development. So let's look at oogenesis first, which is again differentiation of immature oocyte or egg cell into a secondary oocyte. And then a follicle again is the supporting structures around that. So these are densely packed cells surrounding an immature oocyte. The follicle really going to help provide the nutrition and the structural and functional support for this developing cell. Oogenesis begins actually before birth, which is interesting, different than in males. Oogenesis begins before birth with formation of what's called the primary oocyte. Primary oocytes are diploid cells, so they actually have the same number of chromosomes as an adult cell. We're going to need to develop a haploid cell in the mature ovum for obviously for reproductive purposes. So part of the process of oogenesis is going to be conversion of this diploid cell into a haploid cell through the different stages of meiosis. In male, spermatogenesis, remember, begins at puberty. So the primary oocyte is actually surrounded by a follicle, and that's known as the primordial follicle. And this primordial follicle contains an immature primary oocyte. All right, so terminology here can get a little confusing, so try to keep along here. I think trying to draw these pictures is one of the helpful ways of understanding this. At puberty, groups of different primordial follicles will begin to be recruited, and this begins the process of folliculogenesis, which I'll look at here next. And that's going to result in either the death through apoptosis or ovulation of the oocyte. Now, folliculogenesis begins at puberty, it ends at menopause. It lasts for, a lot of people don't know this, for 13 menstrual cycles on average, so about 375 days. So it takes 375 days for a primary oocyte to become a mature ovum. And this process is continuous. So the ovary contains follicles at all stages of development. So unlike that picture I showed you a couple of slides back, where or in the previous video we looked at the ovarian cortex, and you see the nicely arranged different stages of follicular development. Really, the cortex contains follicles at all stages of development. And the process is going to end with ovulation. The majority of follicles never complete their development, and they're going to die. The process begins again with the diploid cells, which are the primordial follicle and the primary follicle, and they're going to be recruited at a constant rate, and they're going to develop into haploid secondary follicles through meiosis, and I'll go through that in just a second here. And then they'll become tertiary follicles, and there are different stages of tertiary follicles: the early, antral, late, and pre-ovulatory. And these are the ones that really show up in that 13th menstrual cycle. And then we have ovulation, which releases the primary oocyte that then has to undergo one more stage of meiosis to become a secondary oocyte before it's ready. It can actually receive a sperm to become a zygote. The tertiary follicles are sensitive to hormones, FSH, which increases their growth, but the early follicles, primordial and secondary, are not as responsive to FSH or other hormones. They are pretty much recruited at a constant rate based on other growth factors in their surrounding environment. We'll start here first with primordial follicles. They contain primitive germ cells, oogonia, and follicular cells. They peak in number at about 18 to 22 weeks post-conception. in the developing fetus. And there's about just under 5 million of them, 4.7 million. So huge number of primordial follicles. This again is in the fetal ovary. The oogonia develop from the embryonic yolk sac cells. So these are endodermal cells. Oogonia, again, are diploid cells, and they enter prophase of meiosis 1. You might want to go review meiosis quickly if you are a little rusty on that, and that becomes the primary oocyte. And they don't complete prophase actually until puberty, so sort of they become arrested at that stage of meiosis, becoming a primary oocyte, which then that process is going to recommence at puberty, and they'll go through the subsequent stages of meiosis. Primary oocytes undergo atresia. So again, at 18 to 22 weeks post-conception, we have the highest number. At birth, it's down to 1 million. At puberty, that number decreases to 25,000 to up to 200,000. By age 30, that number is down to around 26,000. And only 400 over a course of a woman's lifetime will actually reach the pre-ovulatory stage. And only about 1,000 follicles will remain actually at menopause. And we're not exactly sure why those follicles can't be further recruited, but it probably has to do with the decline of the different sex hormones, perhaps also increased oxidative damage and so forth that results in the ovaries. The primordial follicles are recruited at a constant rate, as I mentioned. They're not dependent on gonadotropins like FSH, LH. And again, they develop into primary follicles. The primary follicles, again, developing from the primordial follicles at a constant rate after birth, are about 0.1 millimeter in size. So they're just visible to the naked eye without a microscope. The squamous follicular cells that surround the primordial follicles change into cuboidal granulosa cells. So you can see that here. So here's a primordial follicle up here, and here's the primary follicle. So now we have more cuboidal granulosa cells, and they form a single layer around the oocyte. And there's a glycoprotein. So let me zoom in on this a little bit. So between the oocyte here and this layer of granulosa cells, there is a glycoprotein layer. Maybe I will depict it in red here, right here. And this is known as the zona pellucida. And this is extremely important because when the egg is ovulated, that zona pellucida will go with it. In fact, after the sperm is able to penetrate, it has to go through the zona pellucida to actually fertilize the egg. The zona pellucida stays intact until just before the formation of that blastocyst that I talked about. And so that's going to actually help with the early formation of the embryo. And then surrounding this entire structure, there's a basement membrane. And at this point, growth is still not dependent on gonadotropins or other hormones. It's just happening at a constant rate. So that's a primary follicle developing from a primordial follicle. The next step of folliculogenesis is development of a secondary follicle, and this happens around 290 days or so after the recruitment of the primordial or primary follicle. Again, that's going to be just under 9 to 10 months or so. So granulosa cells are going to continue to grow. They develop into several layers now around this structure. The stromal cells are nearest the basement membrane. They develop into thecal cells. So the theca is going to be 2 layered. So I think I don't have a picture of a secondary follicle on this slide, but if you look down to this is actually a tertiary follicle. So we have to sort of forget about this fluid-filled space here called the antrum, which is not going to happen until the next stage. But for a secondary follicle, we're going to have the egg cell itself, the oocyte, and that's going to be surrounded by the granulosa cells on the outside. And then we're going to have on the basement membrane sort of a layer outside of that. And then on the outside of that will be the thecal cells. So the thecal cells, and there are capillaries and whatnot out here, are the last layer of cells. And there is an internal thecal layer, which is right up against that basement membrane, and that's highly vascularized, and it secretes estrogens. And then there's a theca external, which is an outer layer with has stromal cells and collagen and so forth, so a little more dense. The granulosa cells on the inside here remain avascular, so they're going to have to get their nutrition seeping from the outside in. And they begin to secrete a follicular fluid, and that creates eventually, in this next stage, this fluid-filled antrum. The innermost layer of the granulosa cells becomes fixed to the zona pellucida, and that's going to be called the corona radiata. So here, again, you can't really see it in this picture, but I guess I'll draw it in red. That is, or let's do it in blue. This is the zona pellucida around the egg, and then we have immediately a layer of cells right around that, and that's going to become the corona radiata. And when the egg is ovulated, it's going to take the zona pellucida and the corona radiata with it, and all the rest will remain within the ovary. So that's the secondary follicle. The next stage, which is going to start developing really towards the 13th, maybe the 12th, into the 13th menstrual cycle, is the antral, an early tertiary follicle. And this is where the granulosa and the thecal cells continue to grow. FSH now is going to stimulate the granulosa cells to secrete estrogens, and then LH will stimulate the thecal cells to secrete androgens. So what actually happens is both FSH and LH, although we talk about them as opposite pairs, are secreted at every stage of the menstrual cycle. It's just that in the early menstrual cycle, FSH is highest, and the latter part of the menstrual cycle, LH is highest. But we still get a basal LH secretion during the entire menstrual cycle. That's going to induce the thecal cells to secrete androgens. Those androgens will then move inward to the granulosa cells, and FSH will stimulate aromatase in the granuloma cells to become active, and we will aromatize those androgens into estrogens. So that's how that process works. And now the antrum begins to enlarge as more and more fluid is secreted into it. And then we start to develop 3 layers of cells. So there's a cumulus granulosa cells, also known as the cumulus oophorus, and that's going to surround the oocyte directly. So again, that's all this area here. And then there's going to be these antral granulosa cells, and they're going to surround the antrum, and that's all these cells in here. And then mural granulosa cells are attached to the basement membrane, so they're the deepest layer there. And then thecal cells, again, will be on the outside. The antrum at this point is very rich in growth factors, pituitary hormones, steroids, and different peptides. Finally, we have the late tertiary and what's called the pre-ovulatory follicle. So most of the follicles that started the development 360 days ago, or 12 menstrual cycles ago, have died via atresia. Only 5 to 7 follicles now are left, and they participate in the 13th menstrual cycle. And they become a late tertiary follicle, and they compete with each other for FSH. And only one typically will become predominant, and that will ovulate its egg. And then that remaining follicle will actually go on to become a corpus luteum. The oocyte is expelled from the ovary at the end of the follicular phase of that 13th menstrual cycle. And the ruptured follicle again becomes the corpus luteum, and that's going to secrete progesterone and a little bit of estradiol. Now remember how previously I had said that the primary oocyte actually didn't finish its stage of meiosis before puberty. Well, now it does. So in the late tertiary pre-ovulatory follicle, the primary oocyte actually now completes meiosis 1, and that produces 2 haploid cells of an equal size. One is a smaller cell called the first polar body, and you can see that more clearly down here. So C, this right here, that's going to be the primary oocyte that goes into meiosis 1, and it's going to produce 2 cells. One is a smaller one, the first polar body here, F, and then a larger cell called the secondary oocyte. And that's going to receive most of the cytoplasm, and that's going to start meiosis 2, but it's going to stop at metaphase of that process. The fate of the secondary oocyte now, at ovulation, it's expelled into the pelvic cavity with the first polar body and the zona pellucida around it with the corona radiata. Remember, those are a couple of those granulosa cells that go with it. Normally, these cells are then swept into the uterine tube, If fertilization doesn't occur, the cells will then just degenerate. But if fertilization does occur, when the sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte, meiosis II resumes. The secondary oocyte splits into two haploid cells, again of unequal size. The larger one will become the ovum, and again the sperm has now entered it. When the sperm and the ovum combine, we form the zygote. And the smaller one becomes a secondary polar body which degenerates. So that's complicated, and that's because meiosis is complicated there. We're having chromosomes, so we're creating more of these different structures. So that is kind of the overview of folliculogenesis in a nutshell. This will be important for looking at conditions like polycystic ovarian disorder or ovarian cysts, looking at how follicular development can become abnormal, can develop without, for example, the egg cell inside, and this can create fluid-filled cysts that could rupture and so on and so forth. So again, some of that will be reserved for discussion in gynecology, and some of it we'll talk about here in endocrinology. So next, let's look at the regulation of the whole female reproductive cycle. This is the cyclic monthly changes in both the uterus and the ovaries in non-pregnant females. So really the reproductive cycle involves two things. There's an ovarian cycle, and that's the whole process of oogenesis and folliculogenesis we went through. And then there is the uterine cycle, which is preparation of the uterus to receive the fertilized ovum. And this is regulated primarily by the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and that with its feedback with the ovaries forms the HPO or HPG, G being gonad axis. So the HPO axis, let's just review the details here. So the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, to the anterior pituitary, and gonadotrophs there will release the different gonadotropins. Now, both GnRH causes release of both FSH and LH, but if the GnRH pulses are slow, that tends to release FSH from these gonadotropin cells, versus if the pulses of GnRH are more fast, we have LH being secreted. But again, as I mentioned in the last slide, we have during the entire menstrual cycle both FSH and LH present. It's just that the amounts are going to vary of each during the different phases of the menstrual cycle. In the ovaries, FSH specifically triggers the granulosa cell to synthesize estrogens, primarily estradiol, and I'll talk about the other estrogens coming up here in the next little video. And this is going to stimulate follicular growth. The estrogens then will circulate in the body, they'll bind to estrogen receptors, and I'll just jump ahead and just say estrogen's a little bit more complicated than the other steroids in that it has two primary receptors, alpha and beta receptors, and they have different functions and actions in different tissues, so we have to go through some of that. We'll jump to that later. So that's FSH, so think of that as stimulating estrogens. LH, on the other hand, is basically stimulating the process of steroidogenesis in thecal cells to secrete androgens, primarily testosterone and a little bit of androstenedione. And this also helps stimulate follicular development. The other thing that LH does, especially in higher levels during the second half of the menstrual cycle, is stimulate the corpus luteum to synthesize progesterone. And that's actually going to be from thecal cells in the corpus luteum. They're going to be activated by LH, and instead of androgens, they're going to secrete larger amounts of progesterone. Remember, progesterone is more of an upstream hormone, upstream from the androgens, so we'll be getting large amounts of that being secreted. At mid-cycle, the rising estrogens are what are going to cause a surge in LH, and that's what's going to trigger ovulation, and that's also going to promote the formation of the corpus luteum. And again, the corpus luteum is going to secrete primarily progesterone with a little bit of estradiol, relaxin, and inhibin. Now, progesterone really is going to cooperate with estrogens to prepare the endometrium. We'll go through that process here just coming up. It also prepares the mammary glands in the breast to secrete milk. Other hormones from the ovaries would be inhibin, and this is secreted by granulosa cells and the corpus luteum, and that's going to inhibit FSH and a little bit of inhibits LH a bit as well. There's a competing hormone called activin, and that's going to increase FSH secretion and sensitivity of the cells to FSH. So inhibin and activin are both secreted by the granulosa cells, and they're going to, at different stages of the menstrual cycle, to help activate or inhibit these different processes. So they're going to go along with the estrogen and progesterone. We usually don't talk about them, but they're also in the background here. And then relaxin is secreted by the corpus luteum, and this actually, as the name implies, relaxes the uterus. It's going to inhibit myometrial contractions, and the placenta will also produce lots of relaxin during pregnancy, and that's going to help dilate the uterine cervix at delivery. So basically, by stabilizing, by decreasing the muscle contractions in the uterus in early pregnancy, this will prevent, miscarriage, or trying to prevent the uterus from trying to expel the developing embryo and fetus. And then higher levels later in pregnancy will help relax the cervix for delivery. So that is the basic cycle. And again, these hormones all have feedback cycles. So the activin and inhibin, which are coming from the ovaries, are going to help either activate or inhibit the pituitary secretion of FSH and LH. And then the surge of estradiol in the late follicular phase of the menstrual cycle will cause the surge in LH required for ovulation. All of this is helpful to look at diagrams like this, and I'll go through these stages here in the next slide. But you can see with the lower picture here, this is a picture of the endometrial lining. So we see the shedding of the functional endometrium at the last menstrual cycle. So we define a whole reproductive or menstrual cycle is starting at day 0, which is the first day of menses. And that's usually 4 to 5 days long. And then we have the first, so roughly 2 weeks up to ovulation. That's typically around day 14 and a 28-day cycle. Again, this can vary, and I'll go into that here in just a minute. But if we assume a 28-day cycle with ovulation at day 14, this first part of the menstrual cycle is known as the follicular phase. And that's, as the name implies, this is really where that tertiary follicle is fully developing. And then the second half of the menstrual cycle is the luteal phase, where the corpus luteum develops, and we have a rise not so much of estrogen, which we see in the first part of the cycle in yellow here, but we have a rise in progesterone. Notice the surge of LH here, triggered by the rising estrogen, is going to induce ovulation. There is a second rise of estrogen in the latter part, or the middle to the late part of the luteal phase, and we'll talk about the significance of that. In some women it can be quite high and can actually be higher or near the levels of progesterone, and that can create something called estrogen dominance, which can have all sorts of clinical implications. Notice FSH here also has a little bit of a peak with LH around ovulation, but both FSH and LH tend to have FSH is going up a little bit here during the follicular phase, and that's what's triggering the estrogen secretion. But they both are present in both parts of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so let me go into the details of each step here in the next slide. So duration of the female reproductive cycle is typically 24 to 36 days. That's kind of thought to be the normal range for the reproductive cycle. The average is 28 days. A couple of important terms. Menarche is the first menses, usually occurs around age 12 to 13, although we're seeing that number go down a bit. We think that might be due to the presence of a lot of xenoestrogens in the environment, which might be causing earlier menarche. The first cycles are usually very irregular, and they're also anovulatory. Up to 50, even up to 80% of girls 2 years after menarche are still anovulatory, which means that they would not be able to conceive. Thelarche is breast development after puberty, and that's controlled by estrogens, remember, primarily. And then pubarche is the appearance of axillary and pubic hairs, and that's controlled by androgens, which are secreted earlier at adrenarche. And this occurs about 4 to 5 years before menarche, and this is primarily from adrenal DHEA. So we might see the development of axillary and pubic hair a couple years before there's any breast development. And then menopause is the end of the reproductive phase, occurs between the age of 45 to 55 on average. So again, there's two phases. There's the follicular phase, which includes menses, and the pre-ovulatory phase, and then the luteal phase, which includes ovulation itself, and then the post-ovulatory phase. So let's go through each of these and look in detail at what happens. So in the menstrual phase, this is menses. This is day 0, starts at day 0 of the reproductive cycle, and it lasts on average between 4 and 5 days. Let's look at what's happening in the uterus here first. So with the uterus, the endometrial lining is being shed. So what happens is that the progesterone and estrogens, which suddenly drop off at the end of the last menstrual cycle, last reproductive cycle, causes the release of prostaglandins, specifically PGF2A and PGE2. And that's going to cause the little spiral arteries to constrict in the endometrial lining, and the functional endometrium will infarct. It will die and will slough off. The prostaglandins also cause contraction and cramping of the myometrium. So this is what causes menstrual cramping, can cause a lot of menstrual pain. The prostaglandins sensitize nerve endings to pain as well. And so all of this will result in potentially dysmenorrhea, very painful menses. The menstrual flow will then pass to the cervix and the vagina to the exterior. So really, if you look at what's in that flow, and again, the average is about 50 to 150 milliliters, it consists of blood, tissue, mucus, but a lot of it is endometrial epithelium. So a lot of times when there's a lot of large clots, that's often endometrial tissue that's now been, that you're seeing that's been sloughed off. If you look at the ovary, the FSH, which starts to rise, it's at a fairly low level, but it's going to start to rise during menses itself, is going to help with, again, the follicular development, especially the secondary and tertiary stages of follicular development. Again, this process takes 12 to 13 months to undergo complete development of a primary follicle into the tertiary or Graafian follicle. Okay, so that's the menstrual phase, menses. Then there's the pre-ovulatory phase, and that's the time between menses and ovulation. It's more variable in length than the other phases. So this one can vary from, in a 28-day cycle, anywhere from 6 to 13 days. So there's about a week variation there that can occur. Some tertiary follicles begin to secrete estrogens and inhibin, and that's the inhibin is going to inhibit other follicles. So what happens is around day 6 of the pre-ovulatory phase, a single tertiary follicle in one of the two ovaries becomes the dominant follicle. And estrogens and inhibin that are secreted by that dominant follicle are going to inhibit FSH further, and it's going to cause other follicles to undergo atresia. Now, at this point, we can have the situation where 2 or 3 secondary follicles become codominant and are all ovulated. And that's the situation of fraternal or non-identical twinning or triplets. So those would essentially be codominant follicles which all ovulate. The dominant follicle, also known as the mature Graafian follicle, it continues to enlarge, and it forms this blister-like bulge due to the swelling of the antrum just under the surface. So again, this is happening in the cortex of the ovary. So just if you look at the ovary, you can see this bulge actually happening on the outside, and it's going to continue to secrete estrogens. Now, what happens at this time in the uterus is that the estrogens are going to stimulate the growth of the functional endometrium, and this is known as the proliferative phase. And that functional endometrium, remember, is coming from the dividing basal endometrium. So these, as I showed a few slides back, these endometrial glands begin to develop. These are short and straight. And the arterioles, those spiral arteries, again begin to coil, and they lengthen into the functional endometrium, and the endometrial thickness doubles to about 4 up to 10 millimeters. That's a little on the large side, but it's going to develop, on average 4 to 5 millimeters. And this is, again, the proliferative phase, all being driven by primarily estradiol. And the next phase then is ovulation. This occurs in a 28-day cycle, roughly around day 14. Again, it depends on the length of that pre-ovulatory phase, which is very variable. The increasing estrogens in the late preovulatory phase exert a positive feedback at this point on the hypothalamus, and that's going to increase the frequency of GnRH pulses from the hypothalamus. And that's going to cause the surge of LH from the anterior pituitary. So this is one example of a positive feedback cycle. We don't see a lot of them in physiology, but here we go. LH then is going to cause the rupture, going to help trigger the rupture of the mature follicle, and that's going to help expel the secondary oocyte about 9 hours after that peak of the LH surge. The secondary oocyte remains surrounded again by the zona pellucida and the corona radiata as it leaves the ovary and enters the abdominal cavity, and hopefully it'll make its way up into the uterine tube. Occasionally, though, the oocyte can be lost into the pelvic cavity. It doesn't go into the fallopian tube, and it disintegrates. Also, a small amount of blood and fluid from a ruptured follicle can cause pain, and that is what's known as Mittelschmerz pain. So Mittelschmerz is the ovulation pain that can happen there. Looking at the uterus, this is at ovulation. This is, again, typically if we have fertilization, if it's going to occur typically in the fallopian tubes. But if you look at the uterine, at the pregnancy chances, here is ovulation itself. The best chance of getting pregnant is actually to have intercourse a day before ovulation. And that's because the egg itself can live for about 24 hours after being ovulated. Sperm can live up to 4 to 5 days, but usually the best chances are going to be a day or so before ovulation for pregnancy to occur. Finally, we come to the post-ovulatory phase, and that's the time between ovulation and the onset of the next menses. It's the most constant part of the reproductive cycle. It lasts for about 14 days in a 28-day cycle, so from day 15 to 28. So the corpus luteum, let's actually look at what happens in the uterus first. This is known as the secretory phase. And what happens is that proliferative endometrium transitions into what's called a secretory endometrium. And that's going to be primarily develops under the influence of progesterone, which is being developed here in the ovary. And we'll come back to that here in just a second. So what we see in the uterine wall is the growth and the thickening of the endometrium. The glands will really develop. They'll start to store lots of glycogen, and that's going to peak at around 1 week after ovulation. They'll also become a lot more blood vessels, develop a lot more blood vessels and become more vascularized. If fertilization doesn't occur and the progesterone and estrogen levels again suddenly decline like a typical menstrual cycle, there'll be an abrupt withdrawal of those hormones, and that's what's going to trigger menstruation. Again, via the production of those prostaglandins, which cut off the blood supply from the spiral arteries, and that causes infarction of the endometrial tissue. If fertilization does occur, the endometrial thickening and so forth, and all that glycogen are going to help support implantation of the zygote, and specifically the blastocyst, and that is going to occur anywhere between 6 up to about a week or so after fertilization itself. So that's the secretory phase. At the same time, in the ovary, the corpus luteum is forming. So after ovulation, the mature follicle collapses. The theca internal cells are going to mix with the granulosa cells, and they become corpus luteum cells under the influence of LH. So LH helps that transition. The corpus luteum then will secrete progesterone, a little bit of estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. If the ovulated oocyte is not fertilized, the corpus luteum has a lifespan of only about 2 weeks. It degenerates into the corpus albicans, and the ovarian hormones will fall. We'll see then a rise in the gonadotropins because the negative feedback will be released to the hypothalamus and pituitary. So GnRH will go up, so will FSH and LH, and a whole new ovarian cycle will begin. If the secondary oocyte is fertilized and begins to divide, the corpus luteum will persist, and it is actually maintained by, once the blastocyst implants, it'll start to form a placenta around it, and that will secrete lots of HCG, and that will actually help maintain the corpus luteum for 6 to 8 weeks really into the pregnancy. and then after that the placenta will start to secrete the primary amount of progesterone that's needed. HCG, again, is human chorionic gonadotropin. We're going to see levels start to increase about 8 days after fertilization. It is a pregnancy marker. The typical pregnancy tests are the urine tests. More sensitive would be serum HCG, which can be done in the clinic. Okay, so that is all the events that occur during the female reproductive cycle. In the final video here, I'm going to look at the roles of estrogen and progesterone in more detail, look at steroidogenesis, all the estrogen receptors, how these hormones are metabolized, and their various actions.